The bunker door had been buried for decades, but Boone kept bleeding at the exact spot above it. Metal ticked beneath the concrete as sleet hammered the Quonset roof. Ethan froze, flashlight trembling in his hand, while Boone scraped at a hairline seam until blood marked his paw. Then a cold draft rose through the floor, and Ethan uncovered 4 hidden bolts. What do you think Boone sensed down there? The hiss came before Ethan Walker opened his eyes. Air brakes released somewhere beyond the fogged windshield with a violent rush, followed by the metallic bang of a trailer settling onto its suspension. Ethan's right hand moved before the rest of him did. It shot beneath his jacket toward his hip. Nothing was there. For half a second, neither was Wyoming. There was only darkness, dust, a hard wall against his shoulder, and somebody shouting from somewhere he couldn't see. Then something warm pushed firmly against his knee. Ethan blinked. A black and tan German shepherd stared up at him from the passenger footwell. Boone. The dog's ears eased backward at the sound of his name. He pressed his muzzle against Ethan's hand and held it there. Ethan slowly released the breath trapped in his chest. Outside, diesel pumps stood beneath white fluorescent lights. Frost covered the lower corners of the windshield. Beyond the truck stop, dawn was beginning to expose a flat, gray Wyoming sky. No dust, no radio traffic, no one shouting, just trucks. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I'm here." Boone climbed onto the passenger seat, turned once and sat facing him. Ethan checked the dashboard clock. 5:17 a.m. He had slept maybe 2 hours. The cab smelled of old coffee, wet dog, and the pine air freshener Boone had chewed in half 3 weeks earlier. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face, feeling the rough beard along his jaw. His neck hurt from sleeping upright. His left knee hurt because it always did when the temperature dropped. The Ford's fuel gauge sat below a quarter tank. Ethan reached into the center console and counted his money again. $143. He already knew the number. He counted anyway. It was a habit left over from a life where knowing exactly what remained could keep a bad day from becoming worse. Boone watched him. "Don't look at me like that." The shepherd tilted his head. "I've got a plan." Boone continued staring. Ethan almost smiled. "Fine. I've got coffee." That was closer to the truth. He bought the cheapest refill inside and split the last piece of beef jerky in his pack with Boone. By 6:30, they were back on the road. Ethan had heard the county maintenance department sometimes hired temporary labor when snowmelt started damaging rural roads. He had run equipment before the army, and after Afghanistan he'd spent years doing construction, framing, concrete, drainage, whatever paid. Lately, not much paid. The previous contractor had let him go after a commercial job ended. The room Ethan rented disappeared 2 weeks later when the landlord sold the house. 1 bad month had become 3. Now the Ford was his bedroom, closet, kitchen, and mailing address, except there was no address. That last part caused more trouble than he had expected. At the county administration building, Ethan left the windows cracked for Boone and walked inside. The lobby was overheated and smelled faintly of floor wax. Ethan chose a chair against the wall where he could see both doors without thinking about why. A woman behind the employment counter eventually shook her head. "Road crews full through April. Anything else?" She clicked through her computer. "Sanitation may have seasonal openings next month. Next month doesn't help much." She gave him the tired, apologetic look Ethan had learned to recognize. He nodded before she could say anything. "Thanks." He turned to leave. A cork bulletin board near the exit caught his attention. Job notices, public hearings, livestock permits, tax auctions. At the bottom was a single white sheet curling away from its thumbtack. County disposition. Delinquent parcel. Ethan stopped. 4 acres. Unincorporated land. Foothill property north of the valley. Existing structure listed as a Quonset-type agricultural building. Condition poor, not certified for residential occupancy. Outstanding administrative balance, $5. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. $5. There had to be something missing. He returned to the counter. "Ma'am?" The woman looked up. "This property." She glanced at the notice in his hand. "Oh, that thing. $5. $5 in remaining administrative charges. The county already cleared the delinquent taxes through the disposal process. So what's wrong with it?" That earned the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "How much time do you have?" Ethan said nothing. She pulled up the parcel record. No maintained road to the property. No grid power. No approved septic. Well status unknown. The structure hasn't passed an inspection in decades. Access gets ugly after snowmelt, and winter access may be impossible without equipment. Any liens? Not according to this. Environmental restrictions? None listed. Can somebody else claim ownership after I take it? She looked at him more carefully now. You're serious? I asked a question. If the transfer is completed correctly, you'd receive title subject to whatever easements, zoning restrictions, and recorded encumbrances already exist. I'm not telling you it's a good idea. Ethan glanced through the lobby window. Boone was sitting behind the steering wheel because he'd climbed into Ethan's seat. A little girl passing with her mother pointed and laughed. Ethan looked back at the clerk. Could I stay there? In that building? On my property? Her expression changed. Not pity exactly. Close enough. You'd need to deal with habitation requirements if you're converting the structure into a residence. But the land would be private property. You'd still have to comply with county codes. Private property. Ethan stared at the notice again. He thought about the truck stops where signs prohibited overnight parking, the deputy who had tapped on his window 2 nights earlier, the campground that wanted $38 for a gravel pad. The cold mornings when he woke before sunrise simply so nobody could tell him he had stayed too long. 4 useless acres suddenly didn't sound completely useless. His thumb rubbed the folded edge of the paper. $5 wouldn't buy breakfast for himself and Boone, but it might buy them somewhere to stop moving. Can I see it? The clerk printed a grainy aerial photograph. A dirt track wound toward a ridge covered in dark timber. In a clearing sat a long, semicircular building, its curved roof stained almost black in places. It looked like an overturned metal barrel abandoned in the wilderness. Ethan studied the terrain automatically. Ridge to the north, drainage along the east side, timber thick enough to block most visibility from the road. One approach from the southwest. He caught himself. It wasn't an AO. It was 4 acres of unwanted Wyoming dirt. Still, his eyes kept measuring it. What do I sign? The clerk hesitated. Mr. Walker, I really think you should inspect it first. If I leave, can someone else claim it? Yes. Ethan looked outside again. Boone had moved back to the passenger seat. The shepherd was watching the building now, waiting for Ethan to return. Ethan reached for his wallet. The $5 bill was soft from being folded too many times. He placed it on the counter. The clerk didn't take it. For a moment she simply looked at the bill, then at Ethan. There's one other thing. His hand stopped over the paperwork. What? She lowered her voice even though nobody nearby seemed to be listening. Someone called about this parcel this morning. Ethan looked at the aerial photograph again. Who? They wouldn't give me a name. Asked whether it had been transferred yet. When? Maybe an hour before you walked in. Ethan's eyes settled on the rusted Quonset in the photograph. 4 acres without power. No reliable road. No known well. A building nobody had bothered to inspect in decades. $5. Yet somebody else wanted to know whether it was still available. The clerk pushed the pen toward him. You still want it? Ethan looked through the window at Boone. Then he picked up the pen. Now I do. By noon, Ethan Walker owned 4 acres of Wyoming dirt he had never seen. The deed was folded inside a county envelope on the passenger seat. Boone sat beside it, one paw resting dangerously close to the paper as Ethan's Ford climbed north through country that grew emptier with every mile. Try not to destroy our entire real estate portfolio. Boone glanced at him, then returned his attention to the window. The pavement narrowed to County Road. County Road became gravel, and gravel eventually became 2 muddy tracks cutting between sagebrush and lodgepole pine. Mountains rose ahead beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds. Snow still filled the shaded folds of the higher slopes, but down in the valley, March had begun tearing winter apart. Brown grass showed through melting drifts. Water ran beneath sheets of rotten ice. Every drainage ditch was swollen with cold runoff. Ethan drove slowly. The Ford's front tires were nearly bald, and the steering wheel trembled whenever he crossed deep ruts. 3 miles from the parcel, he stopped. The road ahead had disappeared. Snowmelt had carved a trench through it nearly 4 feet deep, leaving a channel of brown water rushing over exposed stone. Ethan killed the engine. Boone stood immediately. Nope. The shepherd looked toward the windshield. We're walking. Ethan packed water, a flashlight, work gloves, 2 protein bars, a folding saw, and the county map into an old army rucksack. The selection took less than a minute. Boone jumped down. Ethan locked the truck and stood for a moment studying the country ahead. Ridgeline. Drainage. Thick timber on the western slope. Open ground to the east. One narrow approach following the old ranch road. His eyes moved automatically from near ground to distance, searching places where a person could stand without being immediately visible. He caught himself doing it. Knock it off. Boone looked back. Not you. They started uphill. The old road hadn't seen regular traffic in years. Young pines grew between the tire tracks. Fallen branches forced them around several sections, and once they crossed a shallow stream where the bridge had collapsed into the water. Ethan checked the map repeatedly. Half a mile later, Boone stopped. His nose lifted. Ethan stopped too. No command was necessary. Boone stared into the trees. Ethan listened. Wind moved through pine needles. Somewhere uphill, a raven called once. Nothing else. Then Boone relaxed and continued. Probably deer. Still, Ethan noticed his own hand had tightened around the strap of the rucksack. 40 minutes after leaving the truck, they reached an old wire fence half buried beneath brush. One wooden post carried a faded metal marker. Parcel 17-B. Ethan stepped through a gap. Guess this is us. The Quonset appeared another 100 yards ahead. Ethan stopped walking. The photograph had been generous. The building squatted in a clearing beneath the mountain, like something the forest had been trying to digest for 50 years. Its curved corrugated shell was covered with broad blooms of orange rust. Several panels had buckled inward. One end door hung crooked from a single upper hinge, and dead weeds stood waist-high along the walls. A stovepipe leaned from the roof at an angle that suggested the next heavy snow might finish it. Boone trotted ahead. Boone. The dog stopped. Ethan approached more carefully. Broken structures had rules. You didn't trust roofs because they were still above you. You didn't trust floors because they looked solid. You didn't put your hand somewhere you couldn't see. He walked the perimeter first. No recent footprints. No fresh trash. No obvious sign anyone was living there. At the rear, a section of earth had washed away from the foundation. but the concrete itself appeared intact. Ethan returned to the front. He pulled the damaged door open. Metal groaned across the clearing. Inside, the smell hit first. Dust, mouse droppings, old wood, cold iron, something damp and sour from years without sunlight. Boone sneezed. Yeah, luxury. Thin shafts of daylight pierced holes in the curved roof. The concrete floor was buried beneath leaves, dirt, and debris. Broken shelving leaned against one wall. An overturned workbench lay near the center. At the far end stood a cast-iron wood stove. Ethan walked toward it. The stove was rusted but not cracked. He crouched and opened the small door. Old ash remained inside. He examined the pipe connection, then looked upward. Bad seal, crooked flue, fixable. Boone wandered around the building, nose low, investigating every corner. Ethan found an old broom and pushed aside a patch of dirt. Solid concrete underneath. He looked around again. 4 acres. A roof. Walls. A stove. It wasn't much, but nobody could make him leave because a parking lot closed. Nobody could knock on his window at 2 in the morning. Nobody could tell him he'd stayed too long. Then a gust crossed the ridge. Cold air whistled through 3 separate holes in the roof. Ethan looked up. $5 was too much. Boone walked to the stove, circled twice, and lay down. Ethan stared at him. Glad you're satisfied. Boone closed his eyes. That afternoon, Ethan made the place barely usable. He cleared a section of floor, inspected the stove more carefully, and patched the worst gap around the pipe with materials he had carried from the truck. He collected deadfall from the surrounding timber, choosing dry wood from beneath larger fallen trunks rather than wet branches exposed to snow. By dusk, a small fire burned. Smoke drew properly through the chimney. Mostly. Ethan sat on an overturned wooden crate eating cold beans from the can. Boone received half. Outside, the weather changed. The first pellets of sleet struck the Quonset roof. Tick, 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 then hundreds. The sound grew until the entire curved shell seemed to vibrate beneath it. Ethan stopped chewing. For a moment, the stove disappeared. The Quonset disappeared. The hard tapping above him became something flatter and sharper, distant cracks rolling across dry country. His shoulders tightened. His eyes moved to the door. Then the windows. Then the roof count. Listen. Direction. Distance. His body remembered procedures his mind wanted buried. Boone rose. The shepherd crossed the concrete and placed his head over Ethan's boot. Ethan looked down. The spoon in his hand was trembling against the rim of the can. He set it aside. Weather. Boone didn't move. That's all. The sleet intensified. Ethan leaned back against the wall and scratched slowly behind Boone's ear. By midnight, the fire had burned low. Ethan lay inside his sleeping bag near the stove while Boone stretched beside him. He closed his eyes, opened them, closed them again. Every unfamiliar sound received a place in his mind. Branch against metal, wind under damaged door, stove contracting, water dripping somewhere near the rear wall. At 2:47 he checked his watch. At 2:53 he gave up trying to sleep. Ethan added one piece of wood to the stove and watched the orange light crawl across the curved walls. Boone was asleep. At least one of us knows how. Ethan settled back. A few minutes passed. Then Boone's eyes opened. His head rose sharply. Ethan became still. Boone's ears turned forward, not toward the door, not toward the windows. The dog slowly stood. He crossed the Quonset toward the dark rear corner, stopped beside the old workbench, and stared down. Ethan reached for the flashlight. Boone? The shepherd didn't look at him. His nose hovered inches above the concrete. Then Boone gave a low, uncertain whine. Ethan switched on the flashlight. The beam crossed the dirty floor and settled beside Boone's paws. There was nothing there, only concrete. Boone kept staring at it. Ethan watched the dog for another 30 seconds. Boone lowered his nose, sniffed once along the dusty floor, then looked back at Ethan as if expecting him to understand something. "I don't see it." Boone's ears remained forward. Ethan swept the flashlight across the concrete. Dirt, mouse tracks, a few hairline cracks. Nothing worth losing sleep over. "Come on." He tapped his leg. Boone hesitated, then followed him back to the stove. By sunrise, the mystery had been pushed aside by more immediate problems. Water was first. Ethan had less than a gallon left. The county map showed seasonal drainage nearby, but snowmelt wasn't the same thing as drinking water, and Ethan had no intention of spending his first week sick because desperation had made him careless. He was outside splitting deadfall when he heard an engine. Boone heard it first. The shepherd froze, head turned toward the southwest. Ethan set the axe down. A vehicle was climbing somewhere below the ridge. He couldn't see it yet. The sound stopped, started again. Low gear, rough road. Ethan moved without thinking, placing the woodpile between himself and the approach while his eyes searched through the trees. Then he noticed what he'd done. He straightened. "This isn't Kandahar." Boone glanced at him. "Yeah, I know." A faded red ranch truck appeared through the timber. It stopped 20 yards from the Quonset. The driver stayed inside for a moment before opening the door. A woman climbed out carrying 2 blue water containers. She looked to be in her late 50s, with silver beginning to show in her dark hair. Her boots were muddy, her canvas coat had been repaired at one elbow, and she moved like someone who had spent most of her life stepping over frozen ruts and cattle gates. Boone remained beside Ethan. The woman noticed him immediately. "Friendly?" "Depends." "On you." That earned a small smile. "Fair enough." She set down the containers. "Sarah Mitchell. My ranch is about 4 miles south if you follow the drainage." "Ethan Walker." Her eyes moved toward the Quonset. "Saw smoke yesterday. Haven't seen smoke up here in years." She nudged one container with her boot. Figured whoever was foolish enough to move into this thing probably didn't have a working well. Ethan looked at the water. "You don't know me?" "No." "Then why bring it?" Sarah shrugged. "Because you're uphill from me, and dead men make terrible neighbors." Ethan stared at her. Sarah's mouth twitched. "That's a joke. Needs work. So does your house." That almost got him. Almost. Ethan carried the containers inside. When he returned, Sarah was scratching Boone beneath the chin. The dog had apparently completed his background investigation faster than Ethan had. "Traitor," Ethan said. Boone leaned harder against Sarah's hand. She looked toward the building. "You buy it from the county?" "Yesterday. For $5? Ethan narrowed his eyes. "News travels." "Out here?" "News has nothing else to do." Sarah walked several steps toward the edge of the clearing. "My husband knew this place. Long before he died. Used to be part of a sheep operation, or that's what everyone called it." "Called it?" She looked toward the ridge. "When I was a girl, old folks said government trucks came through here. Survey crews. Men with equipment nobody could identify. Cold War years. Government surveyed everything." "Probably." Her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Ethan remembered Boone staring at the floor. He said nothing. Sarah turned back. "There's something else you should know. Here it comes." Blackridge Development has been buying property around this valley. Who are they? Money with an office address. Useful. They're planning something south of here. Vacation homes, resort property, maybe both. Nobody seems to get the same answer twice. Ethan looked across his 4 acres. Can't imagine they're desperate for this. Neither can I. Sarah glanced at the Quonset. But they asked about it last fall. That got his attention. Asked who? Previous county commissioner. Wanted to know when the parcel might clear delinquency. The clerk's words returned. Someone called this morning. Ethan looked toward the old access road. Near the edge of the clearing, the mud held several tire impressions. He walked over. Sarah's truck had broad all-terrain tires with an aggressive block pattern. These were narrower. The tracks were partly softened by yesterday's sleet, but not erased. Recent. Ethan crouched. A vehicle had come up, stopped near the clearing, then backed out. Those yours? Sarah joined him. No. County. Not unless the county upgraded to something expensive. Ethan stood. Boone sniffed the tracks and followed them several yards before Ethan called him back. Sarah studied Ethan's face. You're doing that thing. What thing? Looking at tire tracks like they insulted your mother. Old habit. She didn't ask where it came from. Ethan appreciated that. Sarah left before noon, promising nothing except that he could refill the containers at her ranch until he figured out water. For the next 3 days, Ethan worked. He cleared brush away from the Quonset, rehung the damaged door enough that it could close, covered 2 roof holes with temporary patches. At night, Boone occasionally returned to the rear corner and sniffed the concrete. Ethan began noticing it. He also began ignoring it. There were too many visible problems to worry about. Invisible ones. On the 4th afternoon, Boone barked once from outside. Ethan stepped through the door. A dark gray SUV was coming up the old road, not trying to hide. It rolled into the clearing and stopped without a speck of mud above the wheel wells. The man who climbed out wore polished boots and a charcoal coat that belonged in an office, not on a mountain. Early 50s, neatly cut hair, expensive watch. He looked at Boone before he looked at Ethan. Mr. Walker? Who wants to know, Grant Harlan? He produced a business card. Blackridge Development Group. Ethan didn't take it immediately. Harlan held it there until Ethan finally accepted it. I understand you recently acquired this parcel. Seems everybody understands that. Harlan smiled. We've had an interest in several properties in the area, so I've heard. I'll save us both some time. This land has little practical value by itself. No utilities, poor access, obsolete structure. Bringing it to residential standard could cost considerably more than the property will ever be worth. You're really selling it? Harlan paused. Excuse me? You drove all the way up here to explain how worthless my land is. A faint change crossed Harlan's face. Gone almost immediately. We're prepared to offer $10,000. Ethan looked toward the Quonset. $5 had become $10,000 in 4 days. Why? Parcel consolidation. For what? Long-term development. What kind? Nothing finalized. Harlan reached into his vehicle and removed a thin folder. The offer is straightforward. $10,000 closing expenses covered. You could be finished with this place by the end of the week. Finished. Ethan looked through the open Quonset door. His sleeping bag was visible near the stove. 2 water containers sat against the wall. Boone's food bowl rested beside an overturned crate. It wasn't much. But 4 days ago, there had been nothing there that belonged to them. No. Harlan seemed genuinely surprised. Mr. Walker, You paid $5. I remember. You're being offered 2,000 times your investment. Then you should be happy I said no. Harlan's smile disappeared. Only for a second. Then it returned. If you reconsider, my number is on the card. He climbed into the SUV. Boone stood perfectly still as the vehicle turned around. Ethan watched it disappear through the trees. 10 grand, he murmured. Boone immediately trotted after the fading tire tracks. Boone. The shepherd kept going. Ethan followed. At the edge of the property, Boone left the road and pushed through a patch of sagebrush. He stopped. His nose worked rapidly over the ground. Ethan moved the branches aside. A wooden survey stake had been driven deep into the soil. Bright orange paint marked its top. The surrounding dirt was dark and freshly disturbed. Ethan touched it, still damp. Someone had placed it recently. But what bothered him wasn't the stake. It was where someone had tried to hide it. Ethan looked back toward the rusted Quonset, then toward the road where Grant Harlan had disappeared. 4 useless acres, a condemned metal hut, $10,000. And somebody had been surveying his land before he even knew it belonged to him. Ethan left the stake exactly where he found it. Every instinct told him not to disturb something until he understood why it was there. He photographed it with his phone from several angles, then stepped backward and studied the surrounding ground. 1 set of boot prints, deep heel, large size. The impressions disappeared where pine needles covered the soil. Boone sniffed the nearest print. Leave it. The shepherd looked up. We don't chase people we don't know. That lesson had cost Ethan enough years ago. They walked back toward the Quonset. The building seemed different now. Still ugly. Still rusted. Still barely fit to keep weather out. But no longer worthless. Not if someone was willing to either $10,000 and sneak survey markers onto it. Ethan slipped Harlan's business card into the county envelope containing his deed. He didn't call. Instead, he went to work. The next morning, he drove to a salvage yard outside town, where Sarah had told him to ask for Frank Delaney. Frank was 67 and built like a man who had spent 40 years arguing with heavy machinery. His hands were scarred, his gray beard badly trimmed, and his coveralls carried permanent shadows of grease around the knees. He listened while Ethan explained what he needed. Roofing? Whatever isn't full of holes. That's a demanding standard around here. Frank led him behind the shop. Several stacks of corrugated steel leaned against an old loader. Barn came down last November. Wind took half of it. These survived. Ethan lifted one panel. Surface rust. Straight edges. Usable. How much? Frank looked at Boone sitting beside the Ford. Dog bite? Only accountants. Frank nodded thoughtfully. $20. For all of it? For the roofing. He pointed toward a pile of lumber. Wood's free if you haul it away before my wife sees I've collected more. Ethan studied him. You always run a business like this? No. Sometimes I'm irresponsible. By afternoon, Frank's old flatbed was grinding up the washed-out ranch road, with Ethan riding beside him and Boone squeezed between them. Frank complained about the road for most of the trip. Ethan didn't mind. There was something strangely comfortable about listening to another man complain about ordinary things. Mud, fuel prices, bad bearings, a neighbor who borrowed tools and returned them dirty, problems that belonged entirely to the present. When they reached the Quonset, Frank climbed down and stared at it. You paid money for this? $5. Frank walked around the building. You get change? Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. The sound surprised him. Frank heard it but didn't comment. They worked until sunset. Ethan focused first on the roof. Shelter before comfort. Water before appearance. Heat before furniture. The order came naturally. He climbed only after checking the old metal for weak sections. Frank passed panels up from below while Boone patrolled the clearing, occasionally stopping to watch the road. By the second day, the worst holes were sealed. On the third, Ethan rebuilt the stovepipe connection and added a proper heat shield behind the stove. Frank helped him straighten the front door. It happened while they were freeing the lower hinge. Frank had a long steel pry bar wedged beneath the frame. "Give me another inch." Ethan leaned into the door. Frank shifted his grip. The bar slipped. It hit the concrete. Crack! Ethan was moving before sound became thought. He dropped behind the old workbench, shoulder against the floor, one hand reaching toward an empty place at his waist. Silence. The pry bar rolled in a slow circle, metal scraping concrete. Frank stood motionless. Boone crossed the room immediately. He didn't jump on Ethan. Didn't bark. He simply pressed his body against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan stared beneath the workbench. Concrete. Dust. Boone's pause. A rusted coffee can. His breathing came too fast. He forced air out slowly. Once. Again. Frank bent down, picked up the pry bar, and examined its end. "Well," he said, "didn't improve it." Ethan looked at him. Frank didn't ask what happened. Didn't say he understood. Didn't tell Ethan to relax. He just returned the bar to the door. "When you're ready, I still need that inch." Ethan stayed where he was another few seconds. Then he stood. "Yeah." He wiped his palms against his jeans. "Let's finish it." They did. That evening, Ethan gave Boone an extra piece of chicken from dinner for outstanding service. Boone swallowed it without chewing. "Your standards are low." The shepherd licked his hand. Over the following week, the Quonset began changing in small ways. A door that locked. A roof that mostly stayed dry. Stacked firewood beneath a tarp. 2 clean water containers beside the stove. A shelf for canned food. Nothing matched. Nothing was pretty. But when Ethan entered at night, he no longer saw an abandoned structure. He saw things he had repaired. That mattered. Sarah stopped by twice. The second time, she brought an old enamel coffee pot and refused to take it back. Frank appeared with a box of screws he claimed were taking up valuable space. Ethan knew charity when he saw it. He also knew when people were trying hard not to make it feel like charity. He accepted the screws. At night, the sleep remained difficult. Some nights Ethan woke because of wind, others because of nothing at all. He would find himself sitting upright, listening. Boone learned the pattern. When Ethan's breathing changed, the shepherd would lift his head. If Ethan stood, Boone stood. If Ethan walked to the door, Boone followed. Sometimes Ethan caught himself checking the clearing at 2 in the morning. Tree line, road, windows, door. Then Boone would lean against his leg. "Yeah," Ethan would whisper. No contact. The words slipped out once before he could stop them. He stood there afterward, looking into the darkness. Boone didn't care what decade Ethan thought he was in. He just waited until Ethan returned to bed. Ethan decided the dog deserved something better than cold concrete. Using salvaged lumber, he built a low platform near the stove. He sanded the rough edges and covered it with an old wool blanket Sarah had given him. There. Boone inspected it, sniffed each corner, stepped onto it. Turned twice, lay down. Ethan nodded. Finally. Somebody appreciates craftsmanship. 10 minutes later, Boone got up, crossed the room, and dropped beside Ethan's sleeping bag. Ethan looked at the empty platform. "You're impossible." Boone sighed. The following morning, Ethan found him at the rear of the Quonset again. Same corner, same patch of concrete. Boone's nose moved along the floor. Then he scratched once. Ethan watched. Mouse? Scratch. You're going to ruin your nails. Scratch. Ethan crouched beside him and ran his palm over the concrete. Nothing unusual. He tapped it with his knuckles. Solid. Boone whined. There's nothing there. The dog stared at him. Over the next 2 nights, Boone returned repeatedly. Sniff, scratch, wait. On the 3rd evening, Ethan had enough. All right. He dragged the heavy steel tool cabinet across the floor and positioned it directly over the spot. The cabinet probably weighed 200 pounds once Ethan loaded his tools inside. He wiped his hands. There. Problem solved. Boone stared at the cabinet, then at Ethan. Don't. Boone lay down. For once, Ethan thought he'd won. He went to sleep. Sometime after midnight, a soft sound pulled him awake. Not sleet. Not wind. A whine. Ethan opened his eyes. The stove had burned down to red coals. Boone wasn't beside him. The shepherd sat in the darkness next to the tool cabinet, watching it. Boone. The dog didn't move. Ethan checked his watch, 1:36 a.m. Come here. Nothing. Boone lowered his head and pushed his nose against the narrow gap beneath the cabinet. Then he whined again, low, urgent. Ethan sat up. The hair along Boone's back had risen. Not much. Just enough. Ethan looked at the cabinet, then at the concrete disappearing beneath it. For the first time, he stopped assuming Boone was interested in something living under the floor. Because the dog wasn't behaving like he'd found a mouse. He was behaving like he was waiting for something to answer. Ethan didn't move the cabinet that night. He sat on the edge of his sleeping bag for nearly 10 minutes, watching Boone watch the floor. Nothing happened. Eventually, the shepherd returned to him, circled once and settled down with his back against Ethan's leg. By morning, daylight made the whole thing seem foolish. A dog heard something. Old buildings made noises. Concrete cracked. Metal shifted. Mice nested in walls. Ethan had lived long enough with a mind trained to turn harmless details into warnings. He wasn't going to encourage it. For 2 days, Boone left the spot alone. Ethan worked outside, cutting a shallow drainage channel along the uphill side of the Quonset. Snow was melting faster now, and water had begun collecting against the foundation. He knew what happened when water found its way beneath concrete and froze again. The mountain didn't need to destroy a building all at once. It could do it an inch at a time. On the 3rd afternoon, the weather turned. Clouds rolled over the ridge so quickly they seemed to swallow the peaks. The temperature dropped 15 degrees before sunset. Sarah had warned him. Spring up here lies. By dark, rain hammered the Quonset. Then came sleet. Wind struck the curved shell in long, violent gusts. Ethan checked the roof patches twice and placed buckets beneath 2 smaller leaks. Boone followed him from one end of the building to the other. At 9:18, the generator coughed. The single work light dimmed. Don't. The generator coughed again, then died. Darkness swallowed the Quonset. Ethan froze. Rain roared against the roof. For a moment, the sound became too large. Metal overhead. Darkness. A confined space. His hand tightened around the flashlight before he'd even switched it on. Then another sound reached him. Tick. Ethan stopped. The storm continued above. Tick. Tick. Not the roof. Lower. Boone moved. Ethan heard claws crossing concrete. Stay. Boone stopped. Ethan killed the flashlight before he realized he'd turned it on. Darkness again. He listened. The storm was noise. Noise could hide things, so he separated it the way he had learned years earlier. Wind. Roof loose panel near the eastern wall. Water in the drain. Stove. Then, tick, a pause, tick, tick, metal, underneath him. For 3 seconds, Ethan wasn't standing in Wyoming anymore. He was crouched inside a damaged building half a world away, listening to debris shift somewhere beyond a wall, while dust floated through a narrow beam of light. Someone behind him was breathing too loudly. Someone else wasn't breathing at all. Ethan began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. A wet nose touched his wrist. His eyes opened. Boone stood directly in front of him. Ethan looked down at the shepherd. The dog held his gaze. Right. Ethan swallowed. Present location. He forced himself to identify what he could touch. Concrete under boots. Flashlight in right hand. Wool shirt against neck. Cold air. Boone, Wyoming. Now. His breathing slowed. Let's work the problem. He turned on the flashlight. Boone immediately went to the tool cabinet. Ethan followed. He crouched several feet away and inspected the surrounding floor. No visible movement. He placed 2 fingers against the concrete. Nothing. Tick. This time he felt it. Not much. A faint vibration through the slab. Ethan stood. He checked outside first. Boone remained close as Ethan walked the perimeter in freezing rain. No vehicle lights. No voices. No fresh tracks he could distinguish in the mud. No machinery. The nearest occupied ranch was miles away. They returned inside. Boone went straight back to the cabinet. Okay. Ethan gripped one side. Let's see what you've been losing sleep over. The cabinet scraped across the concrete with a long metallic groan. Boone pushed forward before Ethan had moved it completely. Easy. The shepherd sniffed rapidly along the exposed floor, then scratched. Once, twice, again. Boone, stop. He didn't. His claws scraped hard against concrete. Boone. Ethan reached for his collar. The dog pulled away and scratched again. Then Ethan saw the blood. Enough. His voice changed. Boone stopped immediately. Ethan knelt and took the dog's front paw. One nail had split near the edge. Not torn away, but damaged enough to bleed. You stubborn idiot. Boone licked his wrist. Yeah, that's me talking. Ethan carried the first aid kit over. He cleaned the paw carefully, checked that the nail bed wasn't badly damaged, then wrapped it enough to protect the injury. Boone endured the process with his head resting on Ethan's thigh. You keep this up, you're going to cost more than the property. When Ethan finished, Boone stood. He limped one step, then went directly back to the same place. Ethan stared at him. Unbelievable. Boone lowered his nose. A gust hit the Quonset. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Ethan's hand. Something moved across Boone's neck. His fur. Barely. Ethan leaned closer. The shepherd's coat shifted again. Not from Boone breathing. Air. Ethan held his palm an inch above the concrete. Cold. He moved his hand sideways. Nothing. Back again. Cold air touched his skin. A draft was coming through the floor. Ethan's expression changed. Concrete slabs didn't breathe. He grabbed the broom and swept away years of fine dirt. A pale gray surface emerged beneath. Boone stood over him, favoring the wrapped paw. Ethan brushed harder. 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet. Then he saw the line. So fine he initially mistook it for a crack. But cracks wandered. This didn't. It ran perfectly straight. Ethan followed it with the flashlight. At a corner, it turned 90 degrees. His pulse quickened. He cleared more dirt. Another straight line appeared. Then another. A rectangle. Roughly 3 feet across. Ethan sat back on his heels. "That's not a crack." Boone sniffed the edge. Ethan ran his fingers along it. The gap had been deliberately filled with material almost identical in color to the surrounding concrete. He scraped at one corner with a screwdriver. A small piece broke loose. Something dark appeared beneath it. Metal. Ethan worked more carefully. An inch away, the screwdriver struck something round. He cleared the surface. A bolt head, filled over with mortar. He found a second, then a third. The fourth appeared beneath the place Boone had scratched bloody. 4 bolts, 4 corners. Ethan looked around the Quonset. The rusted stove, the patched roof, the old shelves, the concrete floor he'd walked across every day since arriving. Someone had wanted this opening hidden, not locked. Hidden. The storm rolled over the mountain, and thunder struck somewhere beyond the ridge. Ethan barely noticed. He went to his tools and returned with a hammer. Boone watched from beside him. Back. The shepherd moved several feet away. Ethan tapped the ordinary slab first. A dull, dense knock. He shifted 6 inches. Tapped again. Same sound. Then he placed the hammer over the rectangular section. For a moment, he hesitated. The clerk's warning. The hidden survey stake. Harlan's $10,000 offer. Boone staring at the floor night after night. Ethan brought the hammer down gently. The answer came from beneath them. Hollow. Metallic. Deep enough to carry into whatever waited below. Boone's ears rose. Ethan didn't strike it again. He didn't need to. There was something under the Quonset, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody found the door. Ethan spent the next morning doing almost nothing. At least that was how it would have looked to anyone watching. He didn't pry at the hidden panel. He didn't remove the bolts. He didn't lower a light through a hole to satisfy his curiosity. Instead, he measured. The rectangular outline was 38 inches wide and just over 5 feet long. The slab around it appeared older than the mortar concealing the edges. When Ethan cleaned another foot of concrete, he found faint discoloration, suggesting the opening had once been exposed and later covered. Boone lay nearby with his injured paw stretched in front of him. Every few minutes, his eyes returned to the floor. "I know." Ethan tapped the pencil against his notebook. "You found it." Boone's tail struck the concrete once. "Doesn't mean we're opening it." That earned no tail movement. Ethan had seen what happened when curiosity outran caution. An underground chamber could hold bad air, carbon monoxide, methane, mold, structural damage, decades of trapped gases. The first rule was simple. Unknown didn't mean safe. He drove into town that afternoon. Frank was beneath an old tractor when Ethan entered the workshop. "I need something strange." Frank's voice came from underneath the machine. "That narrows it down." "Gas detector." The rolling creeper stopped. Frank slid out. "What did you find?" "A door. Most buildings have those." "In the floor." Frank stared at him. Ethan showed him the photographs. The joking disappeared. Frank enlarged one image on the phone. "Well, I'll be damned. You ever see anything like it? Not under a sheep shed." "Quonset. Fancy sheep shed." Frank wiped his hands. The volunteer fire department kept a portable multi-gas meter for confined space calls. Frank made a phone call and arranged to borrow it with permission, along with a length of tubing Ethan could use to sample air through a small opening before exposing the chamber. "Don't go down there alone," Frank said. "Wasn't planning to." Frank looked toward Boone. "That doesn't count." Boone stared back at him. Frank reconsidered. "All right. Counts a little." Before returning to the ridge, Ethan stopped at Sarah's ranch. She was repairing a section of fence when he pulled up. "I found something beneath the Quonset." Sarah rested both hands on the fence post. "How bad?" "Don't know yet." He showed her the photograph. Her face tightened. "That wasn't part of the sheep operation." "You sure?" "No rancher I ever met poured a hidden steel door into his barn floor." Ethan gave her the parcel coordinates and told her what he intended to do. "If you don't hear from me by 6 tomorrow evening, call Frank first, then the sheriff." Sarah studied him. "You expecting trouble?" "No." "That's not what I asked." Ethan looked toward the mountains. "I don't like unknown spaces." Sarah nodded once. No questions. Again, Ethan was grateful. Back at the Quonset, he spent several hours carefully removing the material around the edges of the panel. The concrete-colored filler chipped away to reveal steel beneath. Not a steel plate embedded in concrete. A hatch, heavy, industrial. The bolt heads were part of an old locking assembly, though corrosion had nearly fused them in place. Ethan stopped before dark. Boone seemed offended. "Tomorrow." The dog sniffed the seam. "Tomorrow." That night, Ethan slept badly. Not because of the bunker. That was what he told himself. At 4:12 a.m., he woke with his hand pressed against the floor beside his sleeping bag. Boone was watching him. Ethan sat up. "I'm good." The shepherd remained still. Ethan looked toward the dark rectangle at the rear of the Quonset. "No, I'm not opening it at 4 in the morning." Boone lowered his head again. By 10, Ethan had created a small access point along the deteriorated edge without lifting the hatch. He inserted the sampling tube and waited. The meter stabilized. Oxygen acceptable. No combustible gas alarm. No carbon monoxide reading that concerned him. He repeated the test later. Then again. Same result. There was airflow somewhere below. That explained the draft Boone had detected. Ethan was preparing to work on the final corroded fastener when Boone rose suddenly. The shepherd faced the door. An engine approached outside. Ethan covered the exposed portion of the hatch with a canvas dropcloth. He stepped into the clearing. The gray SUV appeared between the trees. Grant Harlan. This time he wasn't carrying a folder. He climbed out and looked at the repaired roof. "You've been busy." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "What do you want?" "I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered." "No." "You haven't heard the new offer. Didn't ask for one." Harlan smiled patiently. $50,000. Ethan said nothing. Wind moved through the clearing. Boone came outside. His injured paw was still wrapped, though he was putting more weight on it now. Harlan looked at him. "That's a significant return on $5. You keep mentioning what I paid. Because it's relevant." "No. What you're willing to pay is relevant." The smile weakened. Ethan continued. 10,000 4 days after I buy it. 50,000 before I've owned it 2 weeks. We're consolidating property." "For what?" "I've explained that." "No. You've repeated a phrase." For the first time, Harlan looked past Ethan, into the Quonset. His gaze moved slowly. Roof, stove, work area, then the rear. Only for a second. But Ethan saw it. Boone moved between them, He didn't bark, didn't growl. His body simply became rigid, head low, eyes fixed on Harlan. Ethan placed 2 fingers lightly against Boone's collar. Easy. Harlan looked down. You should control your dog. He is controlled. Something cold passed through Harlan's expression. Then he looked back at Ethan. Mr. Walker, remote property can become expensive very quickly. Access disputes, code compliance, structural inspections. What feels like freedom today can become a burden tomorrow. Is that advice? Experience. Ethan watched him. Harlan took 1 step toward the Quonset. Boone matched it. Harlan stopped. Then he said something that made the clearing seem suddenly quieter. Owning the surface doesn't mean you know what's underneath it. Ethan felt his heartbeat once, hard. Harlan seemed to realize he'd said too much, but he recovered quickly. My offer remains open for 48 hours. He returned to the SUV. Ethan didn't move until the vehicle disappeared down the road. Boone kept watching long after the engine faded. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. I heard him. They went back inside. Ethan closed the door. Then he pulled away the canvas. The hidden hatch waited beneath it. Harlan knew. Maybe not exactly what was there, but he knew enough. Ethan stared at the remaining mortar. For days he'd been wondering whether opening the thing was worth the risk. That question had just changed. Now he needed to know why somebody else didn't want him looking. He worked slowly. The last crust of filler came away beneath a wire brush. Letters began appearing beneath decades of grime. Ethan wiped the surface with a damp rag. First one word, then another. Boone stood beside him. Faded white stencil marks stretched across the steel. Civil defense, below them smaller letters emerged. Auxiliary shelter. Ethan sat back. The Quonset suddenly made less sense than ever. A ranch building above, a civil defense shelter below, a corporation quietly buying surrounding land, a hidden survey marker, and a man offering $50,000 for something he insisted was worthless. Boone lowered his nose toward the seam. Cold air touched the fur around his muzzle. Ethan placed his palm on the steel hatch. It was colder than the concrete surrounding it. Someone had built a bunker beneath his $5 Quonset, and whatever had been hidden down there had just become important enough for someone to pay him $50,000 not to find it. Ethan did not open the hatch that afternoon. Harlan's warning made him more curious, not less cautious. He spent the remaining daylight checking the gas meter again, studying the hatch mechanism, and clearing everything from the surrounding floor. Then he called Sarah. Tomorrow morning. What time? 8. I'll be there at 7:30. Sarah. 7:30. She hung up. Frank arrived 20 minutes after her the next morning, carrying rope, 2 flashlights, a pry bar, and enough coffee for 6 people. Ethan looked at the equipment. We're opening a hatch, Frank, not invading Normandy. At my age, preparation and paranoia are basically the same thing. Boone limped past them. His damaged nail was improving, though Ethan had replaced the bandage before sunrise. He's not going down, Frank said. Ethan looked at Boone. That's the plan. Boone looked back. Ethan already suspected the plan had weaknesses. The morning was cold and perfectly still. Sunlight entered through the Quonset's grimy windows, laying pale rectangles across the concrete. Ethan sampled the air below once more. Normal oxygen, no alarm. He loosened the last fastener. The hatch refused to move. Frank handed him the pry bar. Your $5 house is fighting back. Ethan worked the edge carefully. Rust cracked. Something deep beneath the floor released with a low metallic groan. The hatch lifted half an inch. Cold air escaped. Not foul, just old. Ethan widened the opening. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Steel steps, concrete walls. The flashlight beam reached perhaps 15 feet before disappearing around a landing. Nobody spoke. Even Frank had lost his jokes. Ethan secured the hatch open. He clipped a second light to his jacket and tested each step with his weight before committing to it. 10 minutes, Sarah said. If I'm not back in 10, don't come down. What do I do? Call for help? Ethan looked at Frank. Same thing. Frank nodded. Ethan turned toward Boone. Stay. The shepherd sat. Good. Ethan descended. First step. Second. Third. His body changed as he entered the darkness. His shoulders lowered. Breathing became quieter. The flashlight stayed slightly away from his torso rather than directly in front of it. At the landing, he stopped. The stairs turned left. His light swept the corner. Empty. Clear, he whispered. The word escaped before he could stop it. Ethan remained still. For one strange second, he expected an answer behind him. Nothing came. No boots. No whispered acknowledgement. No team. Only water dripping somewhere in the dark. He continued. At the bottom was a short concrete corridor. A faded yellow sign hung crookedly on one wall. Shelter capacity 24. Beyond it stood an open steel door. Ethan checked the meter. Safe. He stepped through. The first chamber contained 2 rows of rusted bunks folded against the walls. Several mattresses had rotted into dark stains on the floor. Empty brackets marked places where emergency supplies had once been stored. The second room held cabinets, stripped electrical panels, and the remains of old communications equipment. Someone had removed almost everything useful. No gold, no crates of money, no secret arsenal, just an abandoned shelter. Ethan almost laughed. $50,000 for this? A scraping sound came from the corridor. Ethan spun. Boone stood at the bottom of the stairs. You've got to be kidding me. The shepherd's tail moved once. I said stay. Boone walked past him. Apparently we're reviewing obedience training. From above, Frank called, Everything all right? Dog mutiny. Figured. Ethan let Boone continue but shortened his leash. The shepherd moved slowly through the communications room, nose working. They reached a third chamber. This one was smaller. A desk frame remained bolted to the floor. Rusted filing cabinets stood open and empty. Along the far wall, a heavy shelving unit leaned forward at an angle. Ethan stopped. Something was wrong with it. The front legs had sunk where the concrete had cracked. Above it, old electrical conduit hung from corroded brackets. Don't touch. Boone stared beyond the shelving. His ears shifted. Ethan moved closer. The flashlight revealed a narrow gap behind it. Boone pulled. Easy. The shepherd pulled harder. Ethan crouched to examine the base. A faint metallic creak came from overhead. Boone snapped backward. The leash tightened violently around Ethan's wrist. Ethan fell onto one knee. A second later, the conduit came down. Metal crashed across the floor where Ethan's head and shoulders had been. The sound exploded through the bunker. Ethan rolled instinctively toward the wall. For half a heartbeat, the flashlight beam became white desert sun. Dust. A blast. Someone yelling. Boone cried out. That sound cut through everything. Boone! Ethan was beside him immediately. The dog stood awkwardly, favoring his left side. Blood darkened the fur over his shoulder. No, easy. Ethan's hands moved quickly but carefully. The falling conduit had caught Boone along the upper shoulder. The wound looked like a cut rather than a crushing injury, but blood was already running through the dog's coat. Ethan pulled the first aid pouch from his belt. Boone tried to turn toward the shelving again. Forget it. The dog resisted. Boone. Ethan cleaned the wound enough to see it clearly, applied pressure, then wrapped the shoulder as best he could. His hands were steady. His voice wasn't. You pulled me out of the way. Boone licked his chin. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Another memory tried to surface. A man lying beside a road. A voice saying there wasn't time. Ethan forced it down. Not today. He pressed his forehead briefly against Boone's. Nobody gets left today. He started toward the stairs. Boone refused. The dog planted his feet. What? Boone looked at the leaning shelves. No. The shepherd whined. You're hurt. Boone pulled toward the wall again. Ethan stared at him, then at the shelving. 30 seconds. He secured Boone's leash to the desk frame far from the unstable section. Stay there, hero. Ethan inspected the remaining overhead brackets before approaching. He braced the shelving and shifted it only enough to see behind it. The flashlight beam disappeared into a recess. Not a crack. A compartment. Ethan stopped. He widened the gap. Behind the shelves, a rectangular cavity had been built into the wall and concealed with a removable metal panel. Inside were 3 olive-drab document cases. Waterproof, military surplus, old but intact. Ethan pulled out the first. Maps, survey sheets, photographs. The second held folders sealed inside plastic sleeves. The third contained a dark notebook wrapped in waxed cloth. Boone stopped whining. Ethan lifted the notebook. Dust covered the front. He wiped it with his thumb. A name had been written there in faded black ink. Ethan's hand stopped. He wiped it again. Robert Walker. The bunker became completely silent. Ethan knew that handwriting. He had seen it on birthday cards, on old toolboxes, on the last Christmas card he'd received before his first deployment. Robert Walker. His father. Ethan lowered himself slowly onto the cold concrete. Robert had been dead 11 years. He had never once mentioned Wyoming, never mentioned a civil defense bunker, never mentioned this ridge. Yet his notebook had been sealed inside a hidden compartment beneath land Ethan had somehow bought for $5. Boone limped toward him as far as the leash allowed. Ethan looked at the dog, then back at his father's name. For the first time since discovering the hatch, Black Ridge wasn't the question that frightened him most. The question was much simpler. What had his father known about this place, and why had he taken it to his grave? Ethan carried the document cases upstairs one at a time. Boone came last. The shepherd could climb under his own power, but Ethan kept one hand beneath his chest anyway, taking the steps slowly so the injured shoulder wouldn't bear too much weight. Sarah was waiting at the top. The moment she saw the blood-stained bandage, her face changed. What happened? Falling conduit. To him? To me? He disagreed. Ethan guided Boone onto the wool blanket beside the stove. Frank crouched near the dog. Looks like he won the argument. Usually does. Sarah glanced at the cases. What did you find? Ethan set the notebook on the workbench. My father. Neither of them understood. Ethan wasn't sure he did either. He opened the cover. Robert Walker's handwriting filled the first page. Small, precise, slightly slanted to the right. Ethan touched the paper without meaning to. His father had been a quiet man who could spend an entire Saturday repairing a mower without saying 20 words. He measured twice, sharpened his own saw blades, kept screws sorted by size in coffee cans. After Ethan joined the army, their conversations had become shorter. How's work? Fine. You eating? Yeah. Need money? No. Love you, son. You too, Dad. Then deployments came. Then distance. Then Robert's heart attack 11 years earlier. Ethan had spent years believing there were no unfinished conversations between them because there had barely been conversations at all. Now an entire notebook sat beneath his hand. Frank stood. Sarah and I can give you some room. Ethan nodded. Thanks. Sarah stopped beside Boone before leaving. You need a vet. I know. There's one in town. I'll take him. Only after their trucks disappeared did Ethan open the notebook again. He read until daylight faded. Robert had worked for a private surveying contractor in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Several entries described jobs connected to state agencies and federal infrastructure projects across Wyoming. Most were ordinary. Road grades, drainage studies, foundation assessments. Then the ridge appeared. Project Auxiliary 12. Coordinates matched Ethan's parcel. Robert described an aging civil defense shelter being evaluated for continued emergency use. His crew had mapped rock formations, groundwater movement, and potential access routes around the facility. That explained the bunker. It didn't explain why Robert's notebook had been hidden inside it. Ethan turned another page. A folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the floor. He picked it up. The paper had yellowed around the edges. The photograph showed soldiers standing beside an armored vehicle in Afghanistan. Ethan recognized himself immediately. 28 years old, thinner, dust covering his uniform. He remembered the photograph being taken, but had never owned a copy. Robert had circled Ethan with blue ink. Beneath it he'd written, "Second from left. That's my boy." Ethan sat completely still. Boone lifted his head from the blanket. "I'm fine." The dog kept watching. Ethan returned to the notebook. More clippings appeared between later pages. A local story mentioning Ethan's unit. A photograph from a homecoming ceremony. A short article after several soldiers from the unit were injured overseas. Robert had saved them all. Ethan pressed his thumb against one clipping. He remembered calling his father from Germany after one deployment. Robert had asked whether he wanted to talk about what happened. Ethan had said no. Robert had answered, "All right." At the time, Ethan had heard indifference. Now he wondered whether it had been restraint. Near midnight, he found the entry that stopped him. The date matched the year of Ethan's final Afghanistan deployment. Robert had written only half a page. "Heard from Ethan tonight. Says he's fine." He isn't. Some men come home carrying the ones who didn't. Don't know how to tell my son he doesn't owe the dead the rest of his life. Ethan shut the notebook. Hard. The stove cracked softly. Boone tried to stand. "Stay." Ethan's voice came out rougher than he intended. Boone stayed. Ethan walked outside. Cold air struck his face. The storm had cleared, leaving the sky black and enormous above the mountains. Stars burned over the ridge. Meltwater whispered somewhere below the clearing. Ethan put both hands on the back of his neck. For a moment he could hear another voice. Sergeant Daniel Ruiz laughing because Ethan had complained about powdered coffee. Then the same voice over the radio months later. Short. Controlled. Gone too soon. Ethan shut his eyes. There were names he still avoided saying. Not because he'd forgotten them. Because he hadn't. Behind him came the scrape of claws. Ethan turned. Boone stood in the doorway. "You were told to stay." The shepherd limped outside. "Fantastic." Boone came to him and leaned carefully against his leg, protecting the bandaged shoulder. Ethan looked down. "You don't follow orders worth a damn." Boone's tail moved once. Ethan sat on the Quonset step. For several minutes they watched the ridge together. My old man knew. Boone rested his head against Ethan's thigh. He knew and never said anything. The words hurt in a place Ethan had spent years pretending wasn't there. He scratched Boone gently behind the ear. Maybe I didn't give him much room. They returned inside. Ethan read until dawn. The technical pages became more detailed near the end. Geological sketches, handwritten elevations, lines showing drainage and subsurface formations. One notation appeared repeatedly, R-17. At first, Ethan assumed it was a survey station. Then he found coordinates. A page had been folded over twice to mark it. At the top, Robert had written, R-17 anomaly confirmed after spring test. Below that, do not confuse shelter site with objective. Ethan frowned. Objective? He turned the page. A hand-drawn map covered both sides. The Quonset appeared near the bottom, the bunker beneath it. A line traveled northeast toward the ridge. R-17 was marked roughly 600 yards beyond Ethan's property boundary. Beside it, Robert had written one sentence. The shelter was convenient. The ridge was the reason. Ethan stared at those words as morning light slowly entered the Quonset. The bunker wasn't the secret. It was where someone had stored the secret. Boone woke as Ethan spread the old survey map across the workbench. His bandaged shoulder made getting up awkward, but he stood anyway. No. Ethan pulled on his jacket. You're staying with Sarah today. Boone walked toward the door. Absolutely not. Boone waited beside it. You're injured. The shepherd stared at him. Ethan pointed toward the blanket. Stay. Boone sat. Ethan turned to gather his pack. When he looked back, Boone was standing again. You're unbelievable. The dog's tail moved. Ethan looked at the bandage, then at the old map. He knew forcing Boone through steep country with an injured shoulder would be foolish. He also knew leaving immediately would be foolish. So Ethan did something the younger version of himself had rarely been good at. He waited. 2 days. Boone's wound remained clean. The swelling eased. A veterinarian in town confirmed there was no fracture and ordered restricted activity until the cut healed further. During those 2 days, Ethan studied every document. On the third morning, he called Claire Donovan, the attorney Sarah had recommended. I need somebody who understands property records. That's most of my job. What about old government surveys? A pause. How old? About 45 years? Why? Ethan looked at Robert's map. Because somebody offered me $50,000 for land I bought for Fiv. This time the pause lasted longer. When can you come in? Today. Before leaving, Ethan walked outside with the map. He used the compass on his phone only to verify what he'd already estimated from terrain, northeast, across the timber, up the ridge. In the distance, through a gap between the pines, something bright moved in the morning sun. Orange. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Survey ribbon. New survey ribbon. Far beyond the old Quonset. Exactly in the direction of R-17. He raised binoculars. 1 ribbon became 3. Then he saw a freshly cut line through the brush. Blackridge hadn't just surveyed his parcel. Someone was already working toward the same coordinates his father had hidden underground decades earlier. And whatever R-17 was, Ethan was no longer the only person looking for it. Claire Donovan's office occupied the 2nd floor above a pharmacy in town. She was 39, wore no-nonsense black glasses, and listened without interrupting while Ethan placed copies of the deed, Robert's notebook pages, and the old survey map across her desk. When he finished, she studied him for a long moment. You found these under the property? In the bunker. The bunker that isn't mentioned on the county assessment. That's the one. And Blackridge offered $50,000 before you found the documents. before they knew I found them. Claire leaned back. Don't sell anything. Don't sign anything. And don't assume these papers mean what you want them to mean. Ethan liked her immediately. What do they mean? Right now? They mean we have questions. She pointed at R17. Old geological work can establish historical knowledge. It doesn't automatically establish modern water rights, mineral rights, access rights, or ownership of whatever this is. So we verify it. Exactly. Claire recommended a hydrologist named Dr. Nathan Cole, who had worked on groundwater studies throughout the region. She also gave Ethan another instruction. If Blackridge contacts you, send them to me. I can handle Harlan. I don't doubt it. Claire closed the folder. But handling people alone seems to be a habit of yours. Ethan said nothing. Claire raised an eyebrow. Send him to me. Fine. Boone was waiting in the truck. The veterinarian had removed the heavier shoulder dressing that morning. The cut was closing well, but a shaved patch exposed several inches of pink skin beneath the black fur. Restricted activity. Those had been the vet's exact words. Ethan drove back to the Quonset, telling himself he would obey them. At sunrise the following morning, Boone was standing beside Ethan's pack. No. Boone stared at him. Ethan pointed at the sleeping platform. Doctor's orders. Boone sat beside the pack. That's not your platform. No movement. Ethan had already called Sarah. She was supposed to watch Boone while Ethan checked the nearest accessible point to R17. He picked up the leash. Boone's ears rose. This is not a victory. The shepherd's tail struck the floor. Ethan changed the plan. They would go only as far as Boone could manage comfortably. No climbing. No pushing through unstable ground. If the shoulder bothered him, they turned back. Boone accepted these terms by immediately walking toward the door. The morning was cold and bright. Ethan followed Robert's map northeast through the timber. Boone moved beside him on a short leash. The terrain climbed gradually at first. Patches of old snow survived beneath the pines. Meltwater ran between exposed roots, making the earth soft beneath Ethan's boots. After 300 yards, he found the first orange ribbon. New. The plastic was clean and bright. Ethan crouched. A boot print pressed into the mud beside it. Then another. He studied the pattern. 2 people, possibly 3. Recent. A snapped branch still showed pale wood inside. Boone sniffed the ground. Easy. Ethan looked ahead. The survey line continued uphill. Robert's map showed the same direction. Coincidence was becoming difficult to believe. They climbed another 100 yards. Then Boone stopped. His head turned downhill. Ethan heard it several seconds later. An engine. He didn't move toward the sound. He moved away from it. Old reflex. Never stand on the obvious line when you don't know who is approaching. He guided Boone behind a cluster of granite and pine, staying on public or clearly accessible ground and avoiding the neighboring posted parcel to the east. The engine grew louder. A utility vehicle appeared through the trees below. 2 men inside, hard hats. One wore a Blackridge jacket. They stopped near a survey marker. Ethan remained still. Boone did too. The men talked, but the wind carried their words away. One pointed uphill, toward R17. The other raised a tablet and photographed the slope. 5 minutes later, they drove away. Ethan waited another 3. No second vehicle. No voices. Only then did he move. You saw nothing, he whispered. Boone glanced at him. Good briefing. Near the ridge, the ground became steeper. Ethan checked Boone's gait repeatedly. No obvious worsening. They found the old marker shortly before noon. It was barely visible beneath moss and pine needles, a rusted steel pin driven into stone, stamped into its flattened head, R-17. Ethan stared at it. His father had stood here, maybe 45 years earlier. Same mountain, same wind, different man. A few feet away, newer survey paint marked the rock. Blackridge had found it too. Ethan photographed everything. Coordinates, old marker, new paint, surrounding terrain. Then Boone began sniffing downhill. Nothing else today. Ethan turned back. The safest route appeared to follow a shallow drainage west before cutting toward the Quonset. They had gone perhaps 200 yards when the mountain shifted beneath him. It started with one stone. His right boot landed on loose shale. The surface broke free. Ethan dropped instantly, lowering his center of gravity, but the slope moved with him. Rock hissed downhill. His left leg folded. The world tilted. He slid. Boone barked. Ethan grabbed for a sapling. Missed. 10 feet below, the drainage dropped sharply between exposed rocks. He dug his heels into the shale. Nothing caught. Then the leash snapped tight. Boone had lunged sideways around a pine. The shepherd's body hit the ground. The leash wrapped partially around the trunk. For 1 second, it held Ethan's weight. Enough! Ethan reached. His fingers closed around an exposed root. The slide stopped. He hung there, breathing hard. Boone. A whine answered. Ethan pulled himself upward. When he reached stable ground, Boone was standing awkwardly beside the tree. Blood had appeared along the dog's shoulder. The wound had opened. Damn it! Ethan dropped beside him. Boone licked his face. I told you we were taking it easy. The dog's tail moved. Ethan laughed once despite himself. Yeah, my fault. He pressed clean gauze against the shoulder and wrapped it again. Then they moved slowly home. 2 days later, Dr. Nathan Cole stood over Robert's maps inside Claire's office. He had compared them with modern geological records, spring locations, well logs, and available groundwater data. This isn't a buried lake, he said, and nobody should describe it that way. Claire glanced at Ethan. What is it? A water-bearing formation. Potentially significant. Fractured rock feeding several springs and possibly some domestic wells in the valley. Ethan pointed to R-17. Why mark this location? Likely because the old survey found unusual flow or recharge characteristics here. We'd need modern testing to know capacity. What does that have to do with my land? Nathan laid a newer map over Robert's. Blackridge's proposed development sat several miles south. Then he traced the terrain between it and the ridge. Access. Ethan leaned closer. Nathan continued. Drilling sites, pipelines, power, maintenance roads. Terrain matters. Environmental impact matters. Cost matters. His finger stopped on Ethan's parcel. Your land sits along one of the most practical corridors between the lower development area and this section of ridge. The pieces aligned. The hidden stake. The escalating offers. Harlan looking toward the back of the Quonset. The old bunker. R-17. Blackridge didn't care about Ethan's rusted building. It cared about what could pass through his land. Claire folded her arms. There's more. Ethan looked at her. Of course there is. Finding this doesn't make you king of the mountain. You don't automatically own every gallon of groundwater beneath the ridge. Blackridge can seek permits. They can pursue alternate routes. Depending on existing easements and public utility arguments, they may have legal options you won't like. Ethan stared at the map. For weeks, he had believed discovering the secret would end the fight. Instead, it had only revealed the battlefield. So they can still take it? Claire chose her words carefully. They can try to get what they need without buying you out. Ethan looked down at Boone. The shepherd lay beneath the table, shoulder wrapped again, one paw resting across Ethan's boot. They had found R-17. They had learned why Blackridge wanted the land, and for the first time since this began, Ethan understood the worst part. Knowing the truth didn't mean he had won. It only meant he finally knew what he could lose. The first letter arrived 3 days later. Certified mail. Claire called before Ethan opened it. Blackridge is challenging your access. Ethan stood beside the Quonset door with the envelope in one hand. My access to my own property? The old ranch road crosses multiple parcels before reaching yours. They're arguing that portions of the historical access were never properly recorded as a permanent easement. I've been driving it for weeks. That isn't the same as having an unquestionable legal right. Ethan looked down the muddy track. 4 weeks earlier, it had been nothing but a road. Now every rut seemed capable of becoming a courtroom. The second letter came from the county. Inspection notice. Questions regarding residential use of a structure classified as agricultural storage. The third involved Blackridge's preliminary application to explore alternative utility access across the area. None of it threatened Ethan directly. That was almost worse. No raised voices, no trespassing in the night, no broken windows. Just paper, deadlines, fees, paragraphs written by people who knew exactly how expensive a paragraph could become. Ethan covered the workbench with documents. Boone lay beneath it, shoulder healing slowly. Different kind of contact, Ethan muttered. Boone opened one eye. Ethan spent the next week driving between Claire's office, county departments, and the Quonset. Every trip burned gasoline he couldn't afford. Every answer created 2 more questions. Claire was careful with him. We can fight the access challenge. Cost? Depends. I hate that word. So do clients. And the water issue? Nathan needs more testing if we're going to challenge their assumptions with something stronger than a 40-year-old survey. Cost? Claire didn't answer immediately. That was enough. Ethan looked through her office window. Boone sat in the truck below. The shepherd had figured out how to rest his injured shoulder while still watching the front door. Ethan rubbed his jaw. How long can Blackridge drag this out? Longer than you can afford, if that's their strategy. There it was. The part nobody needed to say. Blackridge didn't have to prove Ethan wrong. It only had to remain richer than he was. 2 days later, Grant Harlan sent another offer. This one came through attorneys. $600,000. Ethan read the number twice, then once more. $600,000. His truck was worth maybe $3,000 on a generous day. He had less than $900 left from temporary repair work and odd jobs. $600,000 could erase every debt, buy a house, replace the Ford, put money away, give Boone a fenced yard and a bed the dog would probably refuse to sleep in. Ethan folded the letter. That afternoon he drove to Frank's shop for lumber. The date on the receipt stopped him. April 19th. He stared at it. Frank was talking about treated posts. Ethan didn't hear him anymore. April 19th. He had known the date was coming. His body had apparently known before his mind admitted it. That explained the last 3 nights, the dreams, the 2 a.m. perimeter checks, the way his hands had been clenching for no reason. 12 years earlier, Afghanistan. A road running through dry country. Daniel Ruiz complaining about the heat. A radio call. Then white light. Ethan set the receipt down. You all right? Frank asked. Yeah. Frank looked at him. Ethan corrected himself. No. Outside, Boone stood from where he'd been lying in the sun. Ethan stepped toward him. Across the yard, a utility crew was working near a transformer. Someone shouted. Ethan turned. White light flashed. The transformer blew with a flat, concussive crack. Ethan hit the gravel. No decision, no thought. 1 second he was standing. The next his forearms were against the ground, shoulders drawn tight, lungs locked. The Wyoming sky vanished. Dust filled the road. His ears rang. Ruiz was somewhere behind him. Ethan. Not Ruiz. Ethan. Frank. But the memory had already opened. A damaged vehicle. Smoke. Rotor wash. A glove lying in the road. The terrible knowledge that training could tell you what to do next, but couldn't change what had already happened. Something heavy pressed against Ethan's chest. Boone. The shepherd pushed himself across Ethan's arms. His nose touched Ethan's jaw. Ethan grabbed the dog's collar. Boone stayed. The ringing faded. Gravel came back beneath Ethan's palms. Then the smell of oil from Frank's shop. Cold air. Wyoming. Now. Ethan rolled onto one knee. I'm okay. Frank stood several feet away, giving him space. Nobody said the sentence Ethan hated. Nobody told him he was safe. Nobody told him it was over. Frank only said, "Take your time." Ethan looked at Boone. The dog was favoring the injured shoulder again, after moving too quickly. Great. Ethan ran a hand along his neck. Now we're both busted. That night, the $600,000 offer lay on the Quonset table. Rain whispered against the roof. Ethan sat beside the stove for almost an hour. He thought about Claire's bills, hydrology reports, road easements, inspections, permits. He thought about how easily Blackridge could turn months into years. Maybe selling wasn't surrender. Maybe it was finally being smart. He had spent too much of his life holding ground after there was nothing left to protect. At 11:30, Ethan packed clothes, Robert's notebook, the deed, Boone's food, the old family photograph he kept inside his rucksack. He carried everything to the Ford. Boone watched from the Quonset doorway. Come on. The shepherd didn't move. Ethan opened the passenger door. Load up. Boone looked at the truck, then back inside. Boone. The dog walked toward him. For a moment, Ethan thought he'd won. Then Boone passed him. He turned around, limped back through the Quonset door, crossed the concrete, and climbed onto the wooden platform Ethan had built weeks earlier, the one Boone almost never used. He lay down. Ethan stood outside. Seriously? Boone rested his head on his paws. There's nothing here worth $600,000. The words echoed inside the curved shell. Boone watched him. Ethan looked around, the patched roof, Frank's salvaged lumber, Sarah's enamel coffee pot, the stove he had rebuilt, the sleeping area, the tool cabinet, the hatch Boone had found. His father's notebook had been hidden beneath this floor for decades. For the first time in months, Ethan knew his neighbors' names. For the first time in years, people knew where to find him. The Ford keys were clenched in his fist. He realized his hand was shaking. Not much. Enough. He loosened his fingers. The keys became still. Boone's tail struck the wooden platform once. You planned this? Another thump. Ethan looked toward the open door. Beyond it, his truck waited in the darkness. He knew that truck. He knew how to leave. Leaving was one skill he had never lost. A marriage, jobs, apartments, towns, people who tried to help before he convinced himself they were better off without him. He looked at Boone. The shepherd had followed every time. Maybe that was why the dog refused now. Ethan walked outside and took the bag from the truck. Then another. He carried everything back inside. Boone lifted his head. Don't get smug. Ethan set Robert's notebook on the table. The $600,000 offer lay beside it. He picked up the offer, folded it once, then put it beneath the notebook. He didn't tear it up. That would have been dramatic. This wasn't about drama. It was about making a decision while knowing exactly what it might cost. The next morning, Ethan drove to Claire's office. Boone rode beside him. Claire looked at Ethan, then at the Blackridge offer he placed on her desk. You're turning it down? Ethan nodded. Then we need to be clear about what comes next. They may make this difficult. They already have. They may make it worse. Ethan looked at the maps covering her desk. For years, every unexpected sound had made some part of him search for the fastest way out. This time he wasn't looking for an exit. Don't help me sell it, he said. Claire waited. Ethan placed one finger on the map of his 4 acres. Help me make them prove every inch of what they're claiming. Claire looked at his finger, then at him. All right. She pulled the Blackridge folder closer. But from now on, you don't improvise. Ethan almost smiled. Wasn't planning to. You document. You stay off property that isn't yours. You don't confront their survey crews. And if Harlan calls, he calls me. Understood. Claire tapped the map. Then we stop reacting and start asking better questions. That part Ethan understood. For the next 3 weeks, his life narrowed into a routine that felt strangely familiar. Observe, record, verify, never assume. He kept a notebook beside the Quonset door. Every unfamiliar vehicle received a date and time. Every new survey marker was photographed from land he could legally access. He mapped drainage channels, existing ranch roads, power lines, springs, and the routes Blackridge appeared most interested in. He didn't follow workers, didn't threaten anyone, didn't cross posted boundaries. Information was useful only if obtaining it didn't create a new problem. Claire worked the paper side. Nathan Cole returned with 2 technicians to examine spring locations and review well records from neighboring ranches. Their preliminary work supported Robert's old survey. Groundwater movement beneath the ridge appeared connected to several lower springs, though nobody could responsibly promise how much water Blackridge could extract without further study. That uncertainty mattered. Blackridge wanted certainty. Ethan's land stood in the middle of the cheapest way to get it. Sarah handled something Ethan never could have organized alone. People. She invited neighboring ranchers to her kitchen one Saturday afternoon. Ethan arrived expecting 4 people. There were 17. Men and women who had lived in the valley for decades crowded around Sarah's long table while maps covered the counter. One rancher pointed toward a spring on Nathan's map. My cattle use that all summer. Another woman said, Our house well is less than a mile downhill. Nobody shouted. That made the room feel more serious. These weren't people trying to stop every new building in Wyoming. They wanted to know what happened to their water if Blackridge got its projections wrong. Sarah looked at Ethan. You started this? No. He shook his head. They did. A few people smiled. Ethan didn't. He had learned long ago that being underestimated could be useful. Being angry usually wasn't. Frank found the next piece. He arrived at the Quonset one morning carrying a cardboard archive box that smelled like dust and mildew. My wife says if this contains hantavirus, you're keeping it. Inside were photocopies of county road records, old maintenance maps, and photographs from a flood control project in the early 1980s. Frank pointed to a faded line. Old access route. Ethan leaned closer. The road crossed the valley, climbed past his parcel, then followed the ridge. Where'd you get this? County archive basement. You break in? I asked Shirley. Who's Shirley? County archivist. Frank looked offended. I have charm. You have grease on your forehead. Part of the charm. Claire later confirmed the records didn't magically settle Ethan's access dispute, but they strengthened the historical case considerably. Piece by piece, Blackridge's pressure stopped feeling like a wall. It became a structure. Structures had weak points. One evening, Ethan spread everything across the workbench. Modern map, Robert's survey, Nathan's preliminary findings, old road records, Blackridge's proposed development. Boone lay beside him. The dog's shoulder had finally closed completely. New fur was beginning to grow over the shaved area, but a thin scar remained. Ethan traced the possible routes with his finger. East route, steep terrain. More disturbance. Longer utility run. West route, additional parcels. Drainage crossing. Then the center. His land. Existing approach. Gentler grade. Direct corridor toward the ridge. Ethan sat back. They don't need my water. Boone lifted his head. They need my ground. The final technical assessment arrived 2 days later. Claire read it twice before calling Ethan. Blackridge had alternatives. That was important. Ethan couldn't simply block the entire project by refusing to cooperate. But every practical alternative carried greater cost, greater construction difficulty, additional negotiations, or greater environmental review. His parcel was not a golden ticket. It was leverage. Real leverage. The negotiation took place in a conference room in Casper. Ethan wore the only decent button-down shirt he owned. Sarah had pressed it because Ethan's idea of ironing had involved hanging it near the stove. Boone remained with Frank. Law offices don't appreciate shepherd hair, Frank had explained. Across the table sat Grant Harlan, 2 Blackridge attorneys, and an engineering consultant. Claire sat beside Ethan. Harlan looked almost exactly as he had at the Quonset. Calm, polished, certain. One of the attorneys slid a document forward. Our previous purchase proposal remains available, $600,000. Ethan looked at it. The number had not become smaller. He thought about the Ford. Debt. A normal house somewhere with a paved driveway. A life where nobody argued over groundwater maps. Harlan folded his hands. You've proved your point, Mr. Walker. You bought well. No. Harlan waited. I bought a place to sleep. Then $600,000 should make this decision simple. Ethan looked through the window. Buildings stretched across the city. Cars moved below. For a moment he pictured taking the money. The thought wasn't shameful anymore. That mattered. He could sell. He simply didn't want to. No. One attorney shifted in his chair. Harlan's expression remained controlled. Then what exactly do you want? Claire placed another document on the table. This. Harlan opened it. A limited utility easement. Not ownership. Not unrestricted access. Blackridge could use a defined corridor if it secured all required permits and complied with independently monitored groundwater conditions. Neighboring domestic wells and established livestock water sources would receive specific protections. Construction damage would be restored. Road improvements required for the project would also preserve Ethan's lawful access. Electrical service would be extended to the Quonset property as part of infrastructure work where legally and technically feasible. A conservation buffer would limit disturbance near sensitive portions of the ridge, and Blackridge would compensate Ethan for the easement and ongoing use. Harlan looked up. This is excessive. Claire answered. Then use another route. Our engineers have evaluated alternatives. So have ours. Silence. One of Blackridge's attorneys whispered to Harlan. Ethan watched them without speaking. He knew that silence. People often rushed to fill it. He didn't. Harlan finally leaned forward. You understand we can continue challenging your access. Claire understands it better than I do, and permitting may not go the way you expect. Then we both wait. Harlan's jaw tightened, only slightly. Ethan saw it. There. The first real crack. Blackridge had money. But money burned during delays, too. Survey crews, engineering contracts, financing schedules, land already purchased, investors expecting progress. For the first time wasn't hurting only Ethan. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Nobody won that day. Not completely. But Blackridge stopped talking about buying Ethan's property. They started discussing his terms. That was the reversal. 3 weeks later, after revisions, independent review, and more legal language than Ethan wanted to read again in his lifetime, the framework agreement was reached. Not everything Ethan requested survived. Reality rarely worked that cleanly, but the parts that mattered did. Protected access, defined easement boundaries, monitoring requirements, restoration obligations, water safeguards for nearby residents, infrastructure improvements, meaningful compensation. Ethan signed last. Harlan watched from across the table. You could have taken the $600,000. Ethan capped the pen, I know. Most people would have. Maybe. Harlan looked at him for another second, then extended his hand. Ethan took it. No triumph. No speech. Just business. Outside, Frank's truck waited at the curb. Boone saw Ethan through the windshield and immediately stood. When Ethan opened the door, the shepherd nearly climbed over Frank to reach him. Apparently I'm disposable now, Frank said. Ethan scratched Boone's neck. We kept it. Frank smiled. The land? The land. On the drive back to the mountains, Ethan watched the ridge appear in the distance. For weeks, every morning had begun with a problem to solve. Blackridge. The bunker. R-17. The road. The permits. The next letter. The next threat. Now the fight was ending. That should have felt like relief. Instead, Ethan noticed something uncomfortable. He didn't know what came after. That evening he stood outside the Quonset while Boone wandered the clearing. The mountain was quiet. No engines, no lawyers, no survey crews, no immediate problem. Ethan listened to the wind moving through the pines. His body remained alert, waiting for the next thing. Nothing came. Boone returned and sat beside him. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head. They had held the ground. Now Ethan faced something he had spent years avoiding, learning how to live on it. By the time snow returned to the ridge, the Quonset still looked rough from a distance. Ethan preferred it that way. The curved steel shell remained scarred with rust. Wind had faded the newer roof patches until they almost matched the old metal. From the lower road, a stranger might still have mistaken the place for an abandoned equipment shed. But inside, winter had lost its teeth. Insulation filled the walls behind simple wood paneling. The floor was warm beneath salvaged planks Frank had helped him mill and fit. A modest kitchen occupied one side of the main room, and clean electric lights hung from the curved ceiling. No generator coughing in the darkness. No buckets beneath roof leaks. No waking to ice along the inside wall. Ethan had built a workshop near the front doors. He repaired generators, pumps, ranch equipment, and small engines for people around the valley. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. People paid him. Sometimes they stayed for coffee. Sarah had been the first. Frank behaved as if he owned the place. Your alignment's wrong, Frank said one afternoon as Ethan rebuilt a hydraulic cylinder. "You haven't looked at it." "Don't need to, then go home." "I would, but your coffee's better." Boone slept beneath the workbench. The shepherd's shoulder had healed, leaving only a narrow ridge of scar tissue hidden beneath new fur. On cold mornings, he sometimes stretched that leg more slowly than the other. Ethan always noticed. Boone always pretended he didn't. The bunker remained below them. Ethan had reinforced the damaged areas, replaced unsafe fixtures, and installed a proper barrier around the stair opening. He had no interest in turning it into a tourist attraction. It had spent enough years hiding things. One room became an archive. Robert Walker's maps were stored flat in protective sleeves. The old survey notebooks sat inside a dry cabinet. Ethan framed one photograph and hung it on the concrete wall. Robert stood beside a survey truck as a young man, one boot on a rock, squinting into the Wyoming sun. Ethan had stared at the picture for almost an hour before hanging it. He still didn't know everything about his father. He never would. That truth no longer felt like betrayal. Some questions simply outlived the people who could answer them. The Black Ridge Agreement brought Ethan enough compensation to clear his worst debts and build stability, but not the fantasy fortune people imagined whenever they heard rumors about the ridge. That suited him. The company improved the access road under the agreement. Electrical service reached the property. Monitoring wells were installed where required, and the neighboring ranch families received regular reports on groundwater conditions. Sarah kept copies. "Because corporations lose paperwork," she explained. Claire kept copies too, because everyone loses paperwork. Ethan kept 3. Old habits. He had also started doing something he once would have considered unnecessary. People knew where he was going. If he worked alone near the ridge, Sarah knew. If he drove into town, Frank usually knew. Not because Ethan needed permission, because disappearing and independence were not the same thing. He was learning that slowly. Some things changed less easily. He still chose seats facing doors. He still woke at small noises. A dropped piece of steel could tighten every muscle in his back before he recognized the sound. He still disliked anyone approaching from behind. The people around him learned without making a ceremony of it. Frank stopped throwing tools across the workshop. Sarah knocked against the outside wall before entering, even when the door stood open. Nobody touched Ethan unexpectedly. Nobody asked him to tell stories he didn't want to tell. That kindness was easier to accept because nobody called it kindness. One December night, the temperature dropped hard after sunset. Sleet began around midnight. Ethan was asleep when it struck the Quonset roof. Sharp, fast, metallic. His eyes opened. His right hand gripped the edge of the mattress. The room disappeared for half a second, then returned. Sleet. Roof stove. Wind through pine. He remained still. Boone was sleeping beside the bed. The shepherd's chest rose, fell, rose again. Ethan listened. Years earlier, he would already have been standing, checking windows, counting exits, searching darkness for something that belonged to another country and another time. His fingers loosened. Boone opened one eye. Ethan looked down. "We're good." The eye closed. Ethan lay back. The sleet continued. He didn't need it to stop before sleeping again. Morning came blue and cold. Fresh snow covered the clearing. Boone burst through the door and immediately buried his nose in it. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying coffee. The shepherd emerged with white powder covering his muzzle. "You look ridiculous." Boone sneezed. Across the valley, smoke rose from Sarah's chimney. Farther down, lights glowed at 2 neighboring ranches. Beneath that frozen ground, water moved through fractures in ancient rock. feeding wells and springs as it had long before anyone drew property lines across a map. Now there were rules protecting it. Not perfect rules, but written ones, enforceable ones. Ethan had learned to appreciate the difference. Boone climbed onto the porch and leaned against his leg. Ethan scratched the dog's shoulder. His fingers found the scar. He remembered blood on black fur in the bunker, the shale breaking loose beneath his boots, Boone refusing to climb into the ford. Before that, the torn nail. Before that, a dog staring at concrete while Ethan insisted there was nothing underneath. Ethan smiled. $5. Boone looked up. Think we got robbed? The shepherd leaned harder against him. Ethan laughed softly. For $5, Boone had found a hollow sound beneath the floor, then a steel hatch, then a forgotten civil defense bunker. The bunker had led Ethan to Robert's notebook. The notebook had led them to R-17. R-17 had exposed what Blackridge really wanted. That was the version someone could put into a headline. But standing there in the snow, Ethan understood that Boone's most important discoveries had never been underground. At a truck stop, when an air brake sent Ethan reaching for a weapon that hadn't been there in years, Boone had found him. During the storm, when the ticking beneath the slab became another damaged building thousands of miles away, Boone had found him. When the transformer exploded and Ethan hit the gravel before he understood why, Boone had found him. And when $600,000 gave Ethan the perfect excuse to disappear again, Boone had refused to follow. The dog hadn't led him to treasure. He had kept leading Ethan back to the present, back to people, back to a place where staying required more courage than leaving. A truck appeared on the lower road. Frank. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized the old pickup. Boone's ears rose. Don't encourage him! The truck climbed toward them. Ethan didn't move inside. He stood on the porch and watched it come. Behind him, warm light spilled through the Quonset windows and stretched across the snow. Beneath that light sat a bunker built during an era when people had prepared to hide underground from a future they feared. Ethan understood that instinct better than most. Build thick walls, control the entrance, stay ready, survive. For years he had done the same thing without concrete. He had built his bunker inside himself. The army hadn't taught him that. Loss had. Guilt had. Too many empty chairs had, and Boone, stubborn old Boone, had spent years scratching at that door too. Frank parked beside the workshop. Before getting out, he knocked twice on the truck's metal door. Ethan heard it. Two sharp sounds. His shoulders tightened, then released. Frank climbed out carrying a paper sack. Breakfast. You expecting coffee? I wouldn't have driven up here for your personality. Sarah's truck appeared farther down the road. Ethan shook his head. Did you invite her? Frank looked offended. I don't organize social events. Sarah pulled into the clearing and lowered her window. I brought cinnamon rolls. Frank immediately abandoned his paper sack. Those homemade? You touch them before we get inside, you'll lose a finger. Boone trotted toward her truck. Traitor, Ethan called. Sarah laughed. For a moment, Ethan remained on the porch alone. He looked toward the ridge. A distant sound rolled across the mountains, low, heavy. It might have been blasting from roadwork far beyond the valley. Once, his body would have answered before his mind could. This time, Ethan noticed the sound. He noticed his breathing. He noticed the cold railing beneath his hand. He noticed Boone waiting beside Sarah's truck. Then he opened the door wider for his friends. He didn't mistake the mountains for Afghanistan. He didn't search for an exit. He went inside. The rusted shell everyone had called worthless stood quietly beneath the snow. Below it remained a bunker built for hiding. Above it was a workshop, coffee, a stubborn dog, two neighbors arguing over cinnamon rolls, and a man who had finally stopped confusing survival with living. Ethan had bought 4 acres for $5 because he needed somewhere he was allowed to stay. Boone had simply spent the rest of the story teaching him how, and maybe that's the part worth remembering. Sometimes home isn't the place you find, it's the place you finally choose not to run from. If you stayed with Ethan and Boone to the end, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe a loyal dog can sometimes understand what a person needs before they do, leave a 0. And subscribe, because there are more stories waiting beyond the next ridge. Stories of veterans, loyal dogs, forgotten places, and second chances that begin where most people would have given up. Until the next story, take care of the ones who stay beside you.